Today, we announce the most significant coordinated federal operation in Chicago's history. What we uncovered was not simple drug trafficking. It was a systemic infiltration of our city's infrastructure by foreign criminal enterprise. Those words, spoken at a federal press briefing just 48 hours ago, would mark the beginning of a reckoning that Chicago had never witnessed. A reckoning that exposed not just cartel operations, but the rot that had been allowed to fester in the shadows of power. Here are the numbers that shattered every assumption about how safe America's third-largest city really was. 4.3 tons of narcotics seized in a single operational window. 98 arrests across 14 separate locations. 700 pounds of pure fentanyl, enough to kill every man, woman, and child in Illinois 3 times over. $42 million in cash and assets frozen before the sun rose twice. And perhaps most disturbing of all, 19 individuals with direct ties to local government and law enforcement now sitting in federal custody. This was not a routine drug bust. This was the dismantling of an empire that had been quietly built beneath Chicago's feet for nearly a decade. An empire run not from Mexico City or Guadalajara, but from office buildings and council chambers right here in the American heartland. If you think you know this story, you don't, because what federal agents found in those pre-dawn raids changed everything we thought we understood about cartel infiltration on American soil. And the next part is worse. 4:17 a.m., South Side Chicago. The temperature hovered at 19 degrees. A thick industrial fog rolled off Lake Michigan, swallowing streetlights whole and turning the city into a gray maze of shadows. The only sounds were distant freight trains and the occasional bark of a stray dog somewhere in the darkness. Then came the engines. 12 unmarked tactical vehicles moved in perfect formation through the empty streets of Englewood. No lights, no sirens. Just the low hum of modified engines built for silence. Behind them, 4 Black Hawk helicopters held position 3 miles out, their rotors barely audible against the winter wind. Inside the lead vehicle, FBI Special Agent Marcus Chen reviewed the target package one final time. His team had spent 11 months building this case, 11 months of surveillance, wiretaps, confidential informants, and sleepless nights. Now, it all came down to the next 45 minutes. The command came through encrypted channels at 4:22 a.m. exactly. Execute. What happened next would later be described by federal officials as the most precisely coordinated multi-agency strike in Chicago's modern history. FBI tactical units hit 3 locations simultaneously across the South Side. DEA enforcement teams breached 2 suspected drug superlabs in Cicero. ICE agents descended on a network of safe houses stretching from Brighton Park to Little Village. And a joint SWAT task force moved on what intelligence had identified as the operational headquarters, a sprawling warehouse complex near the Sanitary and Ship Canal that had been disguised as a frozen food distribution center. The first breach came at a 2-story brick building on South Halsted Street. The door lasted exactly 1.3 seconds against the hydraulic ram. Flashbang grenades lit the interior like lightning. Federal agents in black tactical gear flowed through the structure with practiced precision, their movements choreographed by thousands of hours of training. Inside, they found exactly what the intelligence had promised. And then, they found something far worse. The main floor held 15 suspects, all of them caught in various stages of sleep or panic. Stacks of currency lined the walls, wrapped in plastic and organized by denomination. Forged documents covered a central table, passports, driver's licenses, work permits, all bearing the faces of individuals who had entered the country illegally and been given new American identities by the network. But it was the basement that stopped agents in their tracks. Behind a false wall constructed from industrial shelving sat a pharmaceutical-grade laboratory, stainless steel tables, ventilation systems, precision scales, and row after row of fentanyl pills, pressed and ready for distribution. The DEA chemist who examined the scene would later testify that the facility could produce over 2 million pills per month. 2 million pills, each one potentially lethal, flowing into American communities from a basement in Chicago. Agents seized 1.7 million fentanyl pills from that single location. Across the city, the other strikes were producing similar results. In Cicero, DEA teams discovered a methamphetamine superlab hidden beneath an auto body shop. The operation had been running for at least 3 years without detection. The proprietor, a man with no criminal record and a membership at the local Rotary Club, was found attempting to destroy hard drives when agents breached the door. In Brighton Park, ICE units raided a series of connected apartments that had been converted into a human trafficking transit hub. 23 individuals were rescued from conditions that federal prosecutors would later describe as modern slavery. Some had been held for months, forced to work in cartel-controlled businesses across the Midwest. Others had been promised legitimate jobs and instead found themselves prisoners of a criminal organization that viewed them as disposable assets. But the most significant discovery came at the warehouse complex near the canal. The building had been under surveillance for 6 weeks. Thermal imaging had detected unusual heat signatures. Traffic analysis showed vehicles arriving at irregular hours, always with the same pattern: enter from the east, exit from the west. Never the same vehicle twice in a single week. When the Joint Task Force breached at 4:31 a.m., they encountered armed resistance for the first time that night. Cartel enforcers stationed inside the facility opened fire with automatic weapons. The firefight lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. 3 suspects were killed. 7 more were wounded and taken into custody. 1 federal agent suffered a gunshot wound to the shoulder, but survived. When the smoke cleared, agents found themselves standing in what could only be described as a distribution fortress. The warehouse contained 2.6 tons of cocaine, 400 pounds of heroin, 300 kilograms of methamphetamine, and enough fentanyl to constitute a weapon of mass destruction if released into the water supply. But that wasn't what made investigators go pale. In a climate-controlled back office, behind a reinforced steel door that required cutting tools to breach, agents discovered a server farm. 12 high-capacity machines running constantly, their cooling fans humming in the darkness. And on those servers, encrypted files that would take federal analysts 3 days to fully decode. What they found on those drives changed the entire scope of the investigation. 9:47 a.m. FBI Chicago Field Office, Cyber Forensics Lab. The fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over a room filled with the most advanced decryption equipment in federal inventory. 17 analysts had been working in shifts since the drives arrived at 6 a.m. The encryption was military-grade, the kind of protection you'd expect on classified government systems, not cartel accounting records. That alone told investigators they were dealing with something unprecedented. By mid-morning, the first files began to yield their secrets, and those secrets painted a picture of corruption so vast that senior officials initially questioned whether the data could be authentic. The operation had a name: Project Iron Prairie. According to the decoded documents, Project Iron Prairie was not simply a drug trafficking network. It was a comprehensive infiltration strategy designed by the Sinaloa cartel to establish permanent operational control over the American Midwest. The plan had been in development for over 7 years. Its architect was a figure known in cartel communications only as El Administrador, the administrator. The files revealed a web of financial connections that stretched across 3 continents. Shell companies registered in Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming. Ghost corporations operating out of Panama and the Cayman Islands. Fake non-profit organizations claiming to support immigrant services while actually laundering millions in cartel revenue. A chain of restaurants across Illinois that had never served a single customer but processed over $40 million in credit card transactions annually. Money flowed through this network like blood through arteries. It entered as drug proceeds in Mexico. It was cleaned through cryptocurrency exchanges in Eastern Europe. It returned to the United States as legitimate business investments, real estate purchases, and campaign contributions. Campaign contributions. That was when investigators realized they were no longer dealing with a drug case. They were dealing with a political infiltration operation. The decoded files contained detailed records of payments made to local officials across the Chicago metropolitan area. City council members, county commissioners, judges, police commanders, and at the center of it all, connected to every major decision that had allowed this network to flourish, was a name that made federal agents pause. Governor's Office Liaison. Authorization confirmed. The documents showed that someone operating at the highest levels of Illinois state government had been providing protection for cartel operations for at least 4 years. This individual, later identified as Deputy Chief of Staff Raymond Castellanos, had used his position to influence everything from zoning decisions to law enforcement priorities. He had ensured that certain neighborhoods received reduced police presence. He had blocked investigations that got too close to cartel-connected businesses. He had even arranged for advance warning of federal operations through contacts in local law enforcement. Raymond Castellanos had essentially turned portions of Chicago into a protected zone for the Sinaloa cartel, a sanctuary where drugs could be manufactured, distributed, and sold with minimal interference from the authorities who were supposed to prevent exactly that. The FBI analyst who first decoded the authorization files sat in silence for a full minute before speaking. This is not corruption. This is state-level collusion with a foreign criminal organization. This is something we've never seen before on American soil, and the files suggested the operation was far from complete. Project Iron Prairie had phases. The raids had disrupted Phase 3, but Phase 4, scheduled to begin within 6 months, called for expansion into Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. The cartel wasn't just building a distribution network. They were building an empire. The investigation had just begun. 5 a.m., 3 days later. Federal Tactical Command Center, undisclosed location in the Chicago suburbs. The room hummed with the energy of controlled urgency. Over 200 personnel filled the space, representing every major federal law enforcement agency: FBI, DEA, ICE, DHS, ATF, U.S. Marshals, even representatives from the Department of Defense who had been called in to assess potential national security implications. On the central display wall, a digital map of the greater Chicago metropolitan area pulsed with red markers. 47 locations identified through the decoded intelligence, each one connected to Project Iron Prairie, each one requiring simultaneous neutralization to prevent the network from scattering. The operational commander, DHS Regional Director Sophia Carver, addressed the assembled personnel with the gravity the moment demanded. What we execute in the next 12 hours will determine whether we dismantle this organization or merely wound it. We have one chance, one coordinated strike across 14 jurisdictions. There will be no second opportunity. The resources assembled for Operation Prairie Fire were staggering. 800 federal agents drawn from field offices across 6 states, 42 tactical vehicles, 16 helicopters, including 4 Blackhawks equipped for aerial insertion, maritime units positioned along the Chicago River and Lake Michigan, and for the first time in a domestic operation of this scale, surveillance support from military assets, including drone coverage coordinated through the National Guard. At 5:47 a.m., the order went out. Execute all targets. Operation Prairie Fire is a go. What followed was 6 hours of controlled chaos that would fundamentally reshape law enforcement's understanding of cartel infiltration in America. In Joliet, a DEA tactical team breached a warehouse that intelligence had identified as a secondary drug superlab. They found 300 kilograms of fentanyl in various stages of production and a tunnel entrance that led to a hidden underground facility stretching over 400 feet. The tunnel contained ventilation, lighting, and a rail system for moving product. It had been built over 2 years without detection. In the affluent suburb of Naperville, FBI agents arrested a financial advisor who had been managing cartel investments for over 5 years. His client list included some of the wealthiest families in the Chicago area. None of them had any idea their money was being commingled with drug proceeds. In Aurora, ICE units raided a trucking company that had been used to transport narcotics across state lines. The company's manifests showed legitimate freight deliveries to grocery chains across the Midwest. Hidden compartments in their vehicles told a different story. Over the past 3 years, that single company had moved an estimated 12 tons of drugs into American communities. And in a gated community on Chicago's North Shore, federal agents arrested Deputy Chief of Staff Raymond Castellanos as he attempted to flee in a private vehicle loaded with 3 suitcases of cash and a laptop containing enough evidence to potentially implicate dozens more. Castellanos was taken into custody without resistance. According to agents present at the scene, he said only one thing during his arrest: "You have no idea how deep this goes." By noon, Operation Prairie Fire had produced results that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. 67 additional arrests, 2.1 tons of narcotics seized on top of the initial 4.3 tons from the first raids, $19 million in cash recovered, and a treasure trove of digital evidence that would keep federal prosecutors busy for years. But the most significant discoveries came from the law enforcement personnel who were swept up in the operation. The betrayal of the badge cuts deeper than any wound a bullet can inflict. That statement, made by a veteran Chicago police officer during debriefing, captured the devastation that rippled through local law enforcement as the scope of internal corruption became clear. The seized servers and decoded communications revealed that the Sinaloa cartel had systematically infiltrated Chicago area law enforcement over a period of at least 6 years. The method was sophisticated. They identified officers with financial problems, family vulnerabilities, or ambition that exceeded their opportunities. They approached them carefully, offering small favors that gradually escalated into full cooperation. Some officers had simply looked the other way during drug transactions. Others had provided advance warning of patrol routes and raid schedules. A few had actively participated in cartel operations, using their badges to facilitate shipments and intimidate witnesses. In total, the investigation identified 23 law enforcement personnel across multiple agencies who had been compromised. 11 were Chicago Police Department officers, 4 were Cook County Sheriff's deputies, 3 were Illinois State Police troopers, and 5 were personnel from various suburban departments. The highest-ranking individual arrested was a deputy police chief who had overseen narcotics operations for the entire South Side. He had been receiving monthly payments of $15,000 for over 4 years. In exchange, he had ensured that cartel-connected locations received minimal enforcement attention. He had also leaked information about confidential informants, at least 2 of whom were later found murdered in Mexico. The revelation shattered morale among honest officers who had dedicated their careers to serving their communities. Internal affairs investigators described the atmosphere in Chicago Police Headquarters as a combination of grief and rage. One sergeant, a 22-year veteran, broke down during his interview with federal agents. "I trusted him. We all did. He was my commander, and the whole time he was working for the people we were supposed to be stopping. How do you come back from that?" The corruption extended beyond law enforcement. Federal prosecutors identified 3 Cook County judges who had received payments in exchange for favorable rulings in cases involving cartel-connected defendants. They found evidence that at least 7 city council members had accepted campaign contributions from shell companies linked to Project Iron Prairie. And the investigation into Deputy Chief of Staff Castellanos revealed connections to at least 2 state legislators who had blocked legislation that would have increased penalties for drug trafficking. What emerged was a picture of systematic infiltration that went far beyond anything federal officials had previously encountered. The Sinaloa cartel had not simply bribed individuals, They had constructed a parallel power structure within Chicago's government and law enforcement, a shadow system designed to protect their operations and ensure their long-term survival. As one Homeland Security analyst put it during the federal briefing, they weren't just corrupting the system, they were becoming the system. The rebuilding process would take years, but it had already begun. The map on the command center wall now showed something more disturbing than red dots marking raid locations. It showed connections. Lines stretching from Chicago to cities across the American heartland. St. Louis, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Detroit. Project Iron Prairie was never meant to be limited to Illinois. The decoded files revealed a continental ambition that stunned federal analysts. The Sinaloa cartel had identified the American Midwest as the most strategic territory for expansion, precisely because it had been overlooked. For decades, drug enforcement resources had focused on border states and coastal cities. The heartland was considered secondary, flyover country, safe. The cartel saw opportunity where others saw irrelevance. Their plan called for establishing Chicago as a central distribution hub. From there, product would flow outward along established trucking routes and rail lines. The infrastructure was already built. The highways connected to every major market in the country. The logistics were simpler and cheaper than coastal operations, and law enforcement was spread thin across vast rural territories. The decoded communications showed that cartel leadership had projected annual revenues of over $2 billion once the Midwest network was fully operational. They had identified specific communities for expansion. They had recruited local criminal organizations as junior partners. And they had begun laying the groundwork for similar political infiltration in at least 3 other states. Phase 4 of Project Iron Prairie, scheduled to begin within months, called for establishing permanent operational centers in Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and Detroit. Phase 5 would extend to Minneapolis and Kansas City. By Phase 6, the cartel expected to control drug distribution across 12 states with a combined population of over 80 million people. The scale was breathtaking, and the execution had been meticulous. Federal investigators discovered that the cartel had spent years studying American political systems. They understood campaign finance. They understood lobbying. They understood the vulnerabilities of local government, and they exploited every weakness they found. One recovered document, apparently written by a cartel strategic advisor, summarized the approach with chilling clarity. American democracy is a marketplace. Everything is for sale if you know the price. Find the price, pay it, own the system. The document went on to describe specific techniques for identifying corruptible officials, establishing legitimate business fronts, and gradually increasing influence until cartel interests became indistinguishable from community interests. This was not an invasion. This was colonization through corruption. But the raids had disrupted the timeline. The arrests had removed key personnel, the seizures had destroyed years of investment, and the exposure had made continuation impossible. Federal officials estimated that Operation Prairie Fire had set back cartel operations in the Midwest by at least 5 years. The financial losses alone exceeded $100 million. The reputational damage within cartel hierarchy was immeasurable. But everyone involved understood that this was not a final victory. It was a battle won in a much longer war. The human cost of this story cannot be measured in tons of drugs seized or millions of dollars frozen. It must be measured in the 17-year-old who overdosed on fentanyl in his bedroom because a pill sold as prescription medication was actually poison manufactured in a Chicago basement. It must be measured in the family separated when a father was deported after being exploited by a trafficking network that promised legitimate work and delivered slavery. It must be measured in the communities where children grew up watching drug deals on their corners because the police, who should have protected them, were on a cartel payroll. It must be measured in the trust that was shattered when citizens discovered that their elected officials had sold them out for campaign contributions laundered through fake businesses. The drugs seized in Operation Prairie and Operation Midway Blitz would have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans if they had reached the streets. The fentanyl alone, over 700 pounds combined, represented enough lethal doses to eliminate the population of a major city. This is what was flowing into American communities while corrupted officials looked the other way. This is what was being manufactured in suburban basements while complicit law enforcement protected the operations. This is what was destroying families and neighborhoods while political appointees collected payments for their silence. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through bank transfers and campaign donations and whispered agreements in back rooms. Sometimes it wears a suit instead of a mask. Sometimes the enemy carries a briefcase instead of a weapon. That is what makes this kind of infiltration so dangerous, and that is why exposing it matters. If you're still watching, hit the like button so more people see this story. The individuals arrested in these operations will face federal prosecution. The evidence recovered will fuel investigations for years to come. The networks disrupted will struggle to rebuild. But this story is not over. It never is. The Sinaloa cartel remains one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. Their resources are vast, their patience is infinite, and their ambition extends to every city and town in America where there are customers for their product. What happened in Chicago was a warning, a glimpse of what happens when vigilance fails and corruption takes root. A demonstration of how quickly criminal enterprise can infiltrate the institutions we trust to protect us. The lesson is clear. Silence enables power. Corruption thrives in shadows. And the price of freedom is eternal attention to who wields authority and how they use it. Comment "Expose" if you want stories like this brought into the light. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's happening beneath the surface of American life. And remember, this story is fictional, a dramatization inspired by real issues facing American communities. The names of officials are invented, the specific events are imagined, but the threat they represent is very, very real. As dawn rises over Chicago today, the city continues to heal from wounds most of its residents never knew existed. Federal agents continue processing evidence, prosecutors continue building cases, and honest officers continue the work of rebuilding trust with communities that have every reason to be skeptical. Somewhere in that city, a mother is telling her children that the bad people who poisoned their neighborhood are gone now. Somewhere, a young officer is recommitting to the oath she took to serve and protect, despite everything she learned about colleagues who betrayed that oath. Somewhere, federal agents are already tracking the next network, following the next trail of corruption, preparing for the next operation. Because this fight does not end. It simply moves to the next battlefield. And as long as there are those willing to defend American communities against those who would exploit them, there is hope. The shield of justice does not break. It bends. It strains. Sometimes it cracks. But it holds. It always holds.